All right, welcome to the year 2018. Let's talk about it. So, politically in 2018, we had kind of started off the year in January with a government shutdown. The government shutdown lasted from January 20th to 22nd, and it was over not being able to agree on a budget to fund the government. Some of the things that were up for dispute between Republicans and Democrats here were disputes over DACA. DACA is a program that gives children of illegal immigrants a pathway to become American citizens. So if your parents were illegal, here illegally, but you were born here, and you're not technically a citizen, or you were brought here as a kid by parents, of no fault of your own, your parents bring you. That's not a choice you made. DACA was a program that could potentially grant you citizenship to the United States. So there's disputes over that. And there's disputes over whether or not the government should fund the building of the border wall that President Trump had campaigned on. If one of the big things that Trump would talk about with building a border wall between Mexico and the United States, while he was campaigning, he talked a lot about we were going to build this wall, and that in fact Mexico is going to pay for it. That was like one of his major claims. Mexico, their government flat out said, yeah, that's definitely not happening. We're not paying for that. And so when it came time to actually pay for, the potential construction of this wall, Democrats didn't want to pay for it with government money, while Republicans were in support of paying for it. Ultimately, the government shutdown ended when Democrats agreed to end their filibuster with the Republican promise to allow a debate on DACA. Trump hailed this as a big win. This was kind of, as president, one of his first big tests, this government shutdown. So yeah, that took place. Another thing that happened politically in 2018, when Trump won the 2016 election, even before he won the election, even before the election took place, he said that there would be massive amounts of voter fraud in that election. And then one of his claims, even though he won the election, but lost the popular vote, he claimed that there was still massive amounts of voter fraud that was the reason why he lost the popular vote. So he creates this voter fraud commission. And he I forget this guy's name now, but he put this guy in charge of it. And then in 2018, without reason, brought an end to that commission, presumably because there was no hard evidence of widespread voter fraud. There was questions over whether or not we would get into a trade war with China. President Trump was very tough on trade policy with China, kind of taking that in a different direction than previous administrations had, both Republican and Democratic administrations. So people were worried about the fallout or potential fallout if that were to happen. So that was happening. Really, without trying to pick a side. In fact, one of what most people, even people that were not supportive of President Trump overall, most people would point to actually his trade policies with China as being a success in the wake of this. All right, so the United States, France, and the United Kingdom launched a strike on Syria after they allegedly used chemical weapons on their own people again. So that takes place in 2018. Another big kind of political news story came about how different and Trump was as a president, as far as the people that he appointed to fill key jobs, and how often those people would change. So there kind of became a revolving door in some of these top positions. So like the person he first appointed to be the head of the NSA, National Security Advisory, was Michael Flynn. He was fired after just like 6 or 7 days, something like that. He was then replaced a few different times by H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, Robert O'Brien. His White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Katie Walsh, was forced out of her job. FBI Director James Comey was fired by President Trump. He was replaced by Christopher Wray. His Deputy NSA, Deputy National Security Advisor KT McFarland was forced out of that job. White House Communications Director Mike Dubke resigned. Press Secretary Sean Spicer resigned. He was replaced by Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and then by Stephanie Grisham, and then finally by Kayleigh McEnany. His I cannot talk this afternoon. His White House Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus, was forced out of that job, who was then replaced by John Kelly, Mick Mulvaney, and Mark Meadows. His White House Communications Director, Anthony Scaramucci, this guy here with the face, he was fired after just 10 days on the job, who's later replaced by Hope Hicks, Bill Shine, and Stephanie Grisham. His chief strategist, Steve Bannon, was forced out of that job. One of his top advisors, Sebastian Gorka, was forced out of that job. And HHS Secretary Tom Price was also forced out of that job. So the kind of in and out of a lot of people in key positions in the government was definitely something that was talked about a lot. And there are more. Deputy NSA Director Dina Powell resigned. White House Communications Liaison Omarosa Newman was fired. Director of the CDC, Brenda Fitzgerald, was forced out of that position and would be replaced 2 other times after that. The White House Staff Secretary Rob Porter was forced out. Associate Attorney General Rachel Brand resigned. White House speechwriter David Sorensen was forced out. Economic Advisor Gary Cohn resigned. FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe was fired, and he was fired like just I want to say it was like less than a year, maybe less than 2 years, somewhere in there, short of him being able to like retire and reap his full retirement benefits. So that was a big story. NSA NSA National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster resigned from that position. He was then replaced by John Bolton and Robert O'Brien. VA Secretary David Shulkin was fired. White House Communication Director Hope Hicks resigned. And Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was fired. Again, that kind of constant revolving of people was definitely a big story. All right, and we had big dealings, kind of historic dealings with North Korea. If you remember, the last time in U.S. history that we really talked about North Korea was the Korean War, right? Where North Korea invaded South Korea, and the United States and the United Nations helped, kind of the South Koreans fight off the North. That was, in opposition to communism. We didn't want the whole Korean peninsula to be united under communist rule. And North Korea remained separate from South Korea, and it was divided with the 48th parallel. So North Korea, in the wake of that, after that, in its history up into to today, controlled by a communist government, dictatorship, where the United States and many other top countries in the world kind of refuse to have diplomatic relations with North Korea because of the way they treat their people. So the idea there is that if we were to have diplomatic relations with North Korea, that we would be, in a way, signing off on how they treat their people and so on and so forth. So it's usually why those relations were avoided in the past. So our issues with North Korea in 2018 started where between President Trump and the dictator of North Korea, Kim Jong-un. That's Kim Jong-un here, where they had Twitter beef. They went back and forth with each other over Twitter. So Trump called Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man, and at one point said that, his nuclear button was bigger than Kim Jong-un's nuclear button. And Kim Jong-un replied and called President Trump a dotard. And I wish, here, give me one moment. I'm going to give you the exact definition of dotard because it's a term that's not used much anymore, but it's an old term that means an old person, especially one who has become physically weak or whose mental faculties have declined. So pretty sick burn there, back and forth between these two world leaders. All right, North Korea then had been testing their nuclear missile capabilities over the previous few years. And Trump announces that he's actually going to meet with Kim Jong-un. And this actually is big news because, no sitting U.S. president has met with the leader of North Korea. Former President Clinton met with Kim Jong-un's dad, Kim Jong-il, when Kim Jong-il was still alive and in power. And former President Carter had also met with Kim Jong-il. But no sitting president had met with a North Korean leader. So if that were to take place, that was going to be pretty historic. And kind of one of the negotiations that came out of this was that Kim Jong-un agreed to meet with South Korean leader Moon Jae-in. Again, pretty historic. These two countries, even though they border each other, do not see eye to eye. And so for them to kind of get together and meet diplomatically, not something that had really happened. So in this historic meeting, they announced plans to officially end the Korean War. So even though the fighting of the Korean War had stopped, back in the 1950s, there was never any official negotiated end to the war. There was like no treaty. There was basically just an armistice that they said we agree to stop fighting, but the war never officially ended. So they announced plans to make that actually happen. And the meeting between Kim Jong-un and Trump was scheduled for June 12th. However, that meeting changed dates many times. It was on again, off again. Kim sent a letter to Trump to try to keep the meeting. Trump, when asked about this, he was speaking to the press, and they asked, we hear Kim Jong-un sent you a letter, and Trump was like, yeah, it was a very nice and a very interesting letter. Later on, about 8 minutes later, in the same kind of interview with the press, and he was asked about the letter again. He said, I haven't seen the letter yet. I purposely didn't open the letter. So this meeting officially did take place in 2018. The two leaders met again, historic meeting between sitting president and leader of North Korea. In this meeting, they agreed to work towards complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, and that in response to that, the United States would stop military exercises near the demilitarized zone. So critics of this would say, the United States, a sitting U.S. president should not meet with the leader of North Korea because, the precedent that it sets and it kind of signs off on the atrocities that happen in North Korea, where supporters say, if we're going to make a change in North Korea, you have to meet with them, you have to talk, you have to find a diplomatic solution. So, that was kind of the two sides of that argument there. So, just in the 5 years it's been since 2018, North Korea has not denuclearized, and the United States has not stopped their military exercises near the demilitarized zone. So even though they met and they agreed to these things, neither of those things to this point have happened. And President Trump, speaking of his meeting with Kim Jong-un, he said, I was being really tough, and so was he. And he would go back and forth, and then we fell in love. No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters. They were great letters, and then we fell in love. So, who says you can't have a nice love story in politics? On a much sadder note, there was a mass shooting that happened at a school, a school shooting in Parkland, Florida on February 14th, Valentine's Day. A mass shooting occurred at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, where 17 people were killed, 17 more were wounded. 19-year-old Nicholas Cruz was the shooter. And again, as we've mentioned, as some of these mass shootings that we've talked about in the previous couple of years, another thing that sparks and fuels the debate over whether or not there should be more gun control laws implemented in the United States. This started the hashtag Never Again movement and the March for Our Lives movement. Many of you might remember some of these things. A lot of schools had walkouts, organized by students as a part of this movement. President Trump did meet with Parkland and other school shooting survivors, as well as their parents. And he held an open door meeting with members of Congress and actually surprised a lot of people by calling for action on gun control. However, just a few months later, Trump spoke at an NRA rally and reiterated his full support of the Second Amendment. And, during Trump's presidency, no new gun control laws were implemented. There was also a mass shooting at a Pittsburgh synagogue on October 27th at the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where the shooter killed 11 people who were there worshiping, injured 6 more. And this was the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the United States in U.S. history. The shooter had previously posted anti-Semitic comments online, so this was obviously fueled by those, and that's why he was targeting this particular church or synagogue. The shooter was arrested at the scene and has been charged with 63 federal crimes. Another big event of 2018 was the death of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So Khashoggi was murdered inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He was a Saudi journalist that fled Saudi Arabia because of his criticism of the government. So he was a journalist that, criticized, his own government, the Saudi government, heavily. He was, at the Saudi consulate in Turkey, and he was murdered there. The murder came to be known that it was perpetrated by members of the Saudi government. You have the government of a country that he has criticized murdering this journalist. The Saudi royal family, who's in charge of the government there, denied ordering this killing, but an audio recording of his murder was released. It was, somehow, captured on audio. The area there was, being recorded. And the CIA concluded that the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, actually ordered the killing. And President Trump disputed the CIA's assessment and said that the investigation must continue. So that all of the things involving this murder of this journalist and whether or not the Saudi Arabia government ordered it, MBS specifically, was all very, very much controversial. So dealing with the Supreme Court, Justice Anthony Kennedy announced his retirement from the court. So President Trump nominated Brett Kavanaugh, this guy up here, to fill that spot. And this became one of the most contentious confirmation hearings, Supreme Court confirmation hearings in U.S. history, largely because there were some sexual assault allegations that came about that happened in the past, like many, many years prior, decades prior, in fact. This woman here testified that Kavanaugh had sexually assaulted her when they were in college, I believe. And she gave that testimony to Congress. And so ultimately, during, as tough as this confirmation hearing was, all the back and forth, Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed on a 50-48 vote, which was the closest Supreme Court confirmation since 1881. That was, a pretty big story of 2018. 2018, we also had a midterm election year. Remember, midterm elections happen at kind of the halfway point of a presidency. So these are congressional elections. The House of Representatives, so elections happening in the House, Democrats gained 41 seats and regained control of the House. So if you go back to the midterm elections in 2014, that was when Republicans gained control of the House from Democrats and held it for those 4 years. And then in 2018, Democrats win control back. Or 2016, I'm sorry. 2016 is when they lost control. So that makes Nancy Pelosi Speaker of the House again. So she was previously Speaker of the House when Democrats had control before, becomes Speaker of the House again. In the Senate, the Republicans retained their majority and actually gained 2 seats. And in governor elections or gubernatorial elections through in 2018, Democrats gained 7 governors. So there are still more Republican governors than Democratic governors, but Democrats gained plus 7 governors in that election. And this was the highest voter turnout that we had seen in a midterm election since 1914, where 50.3% of eligible voters voted. If you compare that to the 2014 midterm elections, just 4 years prior, that was at 36.7%. So that's a big jump, right? So this was a big election swing, mostly in favor of Democrats. All right, some other major events of the year 2018. That special counsel investigation that I mentioned in 2017 that started, the Mueller investigation into any potential ties between Trump and the campaign and Russia, was ongoing throughout 2018. So still going on. There was a scandal involving President Trump during his campaign involving illegally, or his potential hush money payments to Stormy Daniels, this woman here. That's something that's still ongoing today. He has actually currently been indicted over this issue. So this all came out in 2018. President Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen's office, was raided by the FBI. He would later go on, I think next year in 2019, he'll serve jail time. I'll talk more about that. Trump hired Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York, to be his attorney overseeing the investigation, the Russia investigation, the Mueller investigation. And he contradicted previous statements that President Trump had made. Trump announced that the United States would pull out of the Iran nuclear deal. That was the deal that President Obama had made in 2015 or 16. And Trump announces that the United States is officially going to pull out of that deal. Senate Democrats were going to force a vote to reinstate net neutrality. And at the G7 summit, Trump pushed for it to return to the G8 to include Russia. So this is a summit of like the top leaders in the world. It had formally included Russia. Then when Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine, Russia was kicked out, and Trump called for Russia to return to that summit. We had another royal wedding in 2018. Prince Harry married Meghan Markle, American Meghan Markle. So that was big news. Saudi Arabia allowed women to drive. This was also historic news because women previously could not drive or do many other things in Saudi Arabia. So this was a very big advancement as far for women in that country. Trump ended the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that we had in place with Russia, dealing with nuclear weapons and armistice and all that stuff. There were California wildfires that destroyed a lot of area in California. And we saw another government shutdown over funding for the border wall that took place, actually lasted from December 22nd to January 25th. So over a month, which was the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. These are all the people we lost in 2018. One of my all-time favorite singers, Dolores O'Riordan of the amazing group The Cranberries, passed away. That one was tough. That was a tough one on me. Barbara Bush, former First Lady, she passed away. Reverend Billy Graham, famous televangelist since the 1950s, he passed away. Scientist Stephen Hawking passed away. Old school rapper Craig Mack passed away in 2018, as well as R. Lee Ermey, actor. You might, if you've seen the Toy Story movies, he was the voice of like the army guys, also in many other movies prior to that, usually playing a military drill sergeant, because that's what he was before he was an actor. All right, checkpoint real quick. Which event fueled student protests across the country, known as March for Our Lives, calling for more strict gun control legislation? Was that the mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, the mass shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, or the Las Vegas mass shooting? And that was the one at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. Which of these was not an issue involved in the government shutdown in January of 2018? Was it disputes over DACA, pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement, failure to agree on a budget, or funding for the border wall? And yes, pulling out of the Iran nuclear agreement is the correct response here. All right, everybody, have a great day. Thanks for checking this out.